Keith Morris. I'm coming from the Willow Crossing Farm in Vermont. I am actually a second-generation cannabis farmer. My parents probably wouldn't like to be identified that way. Definitely come from the school of permaculture in the sense of a whole farm planning perspective, and not just farm planning really, but how we plan our livelihoods, how we meet our needs while increasing ecological health. And one of the things we do in permaculture design is we do a niche analysis, and we look at the yields of something, and we look at what something needs in order to figure out how we best fit it into our systems in ways that help other things. And when we do a niche analysis of the hemp plant, we see medicine, we see building materials, hempcrete, we see fiber, we see fodder for animals, we see paper and textiles, we see seed and a very high-fat, nutrient-dense seed, which is both valuable as animal feed as well as human food. And it's really a fascinating study of human-plant coevolution. It's one of the oldest plants in cultivation in the history of the world, and goes back in written pharmacopoeias over 3,000 years BC. Just recently, 120,000-year-old cave excavation found, for lack of a better term, that the entire cave was a hotbox, and they realized that this shrine was essentially, coated in resin all over the surfaces of the cave because people were burning marijuana in this cave and enclosing themselves in it. These, of course, are, proto-strains with incredibly low concentrates of many of the things that we've since bred to express more potently, but people were obviously very aware of its intoxicating effects, and like most intoxicating plants, was used in a ceremonial and sacred context in ways that kind of limited its potential for abuse. So how did it spread all over the world? Well, ancient Indo-European, ancient Indo-European travelers whose nomadic path would later come to be known as the Silk Road were traveling throughout Eurasia and carried with them the hemp plant. This same group of people are believed to have invented the wheel and are the ones who eventually came to tokenize, for lack of a better word, the cannabis plant. And we find it in their grave sites, we find it in their artistic motifs, and having traveled with humans so long into so many different ecosystems, it of course begins to express itself differently as subject to natural selection, and maybe even more so, artificial selection. And because people have chosen it for its seeds and its seed as food, people have chosen it for its fiber and its height for cordage. And that, of course, the fiber industry is really where hemp plays such a key role in the history of the United States. The Constitution, for instance, is written on hemp paper. And for a time during the colonial years, it was illegal for landowning farmers not to produce hemp, which was considered essential for the common good in rope, sail fabric, and textiles, not least of which, were clothing and other things. Henry Ford famously created hemp-derived plastics and made an entire hemp car very early on in the development of the Ford Motor Company, and ran this car also on hemp biofuel. That these types of things are really what caught the attention of industrialists with a vested interest in forestry, as was mentioned, particularly Randolph Hearst, who owned over 28 of the major market newspaper publications in the 1930s in the United States, was also significantly vested in forestry for paper, for pulp paper, and used his paper to popularize the idea of this damaging, dangerous drug associated with hemp. And I think it's really important that we do draw the distinction between hemp and quote-unquote marijuana. These days, it's actually, the phrase marijuana is actually potentially a passé phrase. There's a movement afoot to stop using that word because of its associations in the criminal history of this plant in the United States. Specifically, so there's several pronged front that was happening here. One, there was a bunch of vested industrialists, not only, of course, in timber and paper from wood, but plastics and petroleum-derived synthetic materials. Dow and DuPont made this slide for that reason. And they, of course, were very vested in the first drafting of prohibition laws. Also, let's be honest with the racist history of our country at times and places, including now, but the phrase marijuana, the word marijuana, was used to explicitly associate this with Mexican and Mexican immigrants at the time of the Mexican-American War, and its association with Mexican immigrants, with Native Americans, with African Americans, with jazz musicians. This is a quote from the United States government. There are 100, during the 30s, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. The marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. And thus, the plant was promptly prohibited. And since then, it's really interesting because, of course, what was then, after the 30s, once this plant was considered a prohibited substance, this was also one of the most effective tools for the suppression of both civil rights and the anti-war movement, right? Whether or not civil rights and anti-war activists were or were not engaged in marijuana smoking, I mean, probably they were to a certain degree, but not proportionate to the level of prosecution that certain prominent activists would face, and sometimes even fabricated. And we're continuing to get more and more information about that as we learn about, you know, the depths of COINTELPRO and really just how far the feds went to set people up when they were threatened. So it's an interesting history, and you know what's happened, of course, then after Nixon and the anti-war, anti-civil rights criminalization of marijuana really got a toehold, the economics of prohibition really kicked in. And that's what we see during the Reagan years, during both Bushes, was looking at how profitable the prison industrial complex really is, which has been one of the major supporters of its continued prohibition. And what we're continuing to see. Yes, the war on drugs has, of course, you know, we associate it with drugs that we think of as very, very potentially dangerous, hard drugs, but the vast majority of arrests related to the war on drugs were marijuana arrests. In 1998 alone, over 800,000 Americans were arrested for a plant that, in case of California, had just been legalized. So I'm not here to talk about the history of prohibition of marijuana, but I think it's really interesting when we watch what's happened, especially in this 80s, 90s era, increased scrutiny, which is a big part of why this plant has moved indoors, and why a big part of why some of the most skilled horticulturalists in the United States have found themselves first in Amsterdam for safe haven, and then in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, and now slowly kind of coming back from this expatriate status as we see Washington, D.C., Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, etc., begin to loosen their grip, so to speak, although we haven't yet at the federal level. So another thing that's fascinating when we start looking at the medicinal potential of marijuana are these newly discovered things. Again, we just started really learning about this in the late 1990s. The 2000s, 2010 have been frontiers of essentially cannabis medicine. Endocannabinoids are parts of our body's receptors that essentially, if we look at the molecular structure of cannabis, it is like a key to a lock. The lock precisely fitting various components of not only our brains, but other of our adrenal systems, our immune systems, our appetite suppression and stimulation systems. And this isn't a coincidence. And it isn't to say that there isn't profound coevolution specifically between humans and the cannabis plant, but much more anciently than that, endocannabinoids, these little reward triggers essentially, are common all the way through to the simplest of sponges, and so are shared throughout the animal family. And it's most likely the case that the cannabis plant derived these things specifically for pest insects. And in the case of their proportions that affect us in more modulated ways, they can be, toxic or fatally toxic to certain pest insects. So as a organism with both an incredible problem-solving ability and a brain that gives us these really interesting sense and reward type systems, we've short-circuited by our relationship with a plant that can feed into some of these things, for better or worse. And by no means do I mean to dismiss the potential for misuse or abuse, even as someone who believes that cannabis should be legal. That doesn't mean to say that everyone should use it, and that doesn't mean to say that, and that is to say that everyone who does use it should use it responsibly, right? That said, as we start to get much better understanding of really what's going on in this plant, and still to this day, even right now in 2018, with some 39 states legal for medical use in the United States, it is a Schedule I class drug at the federal level, which means it is, by federal classification, more dangerous than opioids and cocaine, right? And this is where we start getting into the real nuances of the frontiers of cannabis medicine in terms of like the CBD, the CBDA, the CBDB, the THCA, the THCB, things that frankly wouldn't fit into this presentation, and honestly I haven't synthesized enough to really share much of tremendous value about. But we have over 500 compounds in the cannabis plant. THC is one of those compounds, or a small group of some of those compounds. And that's the one, of course, we're most familiar with and that's most popular, that's bred for the intoxicating effects of recreational marijuana. It is the disorienting component of this plant. However, among the hundreds of other compounds, we're finding them either impacting sleep. For instance, they can cause you to sleep, or they can cause you to wake up. And that's one of the other very interesting branches in the cannabis family is, how these effects are. We have both, appetite increase, which I'm sure, most folks are familiar with, in popular culture, the munchies, etc. But there are actually strains of cannabis specifically triggering appetite suppression, which are being used therapeutically for some folks. So we have this incredible array of compounds that we're really just beginning to understand, and almost all of the research is coming from countries outside of the United States where it's still completely illegal on the federal level. Any studies done on the federal level are all coming from one grow operation at the Ole Miss Pharmacy School in Mississippi, and it's funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I was a part of a study at UVM for marijuana's impacts on schizophrenics, not as a schizophrenic but as a control, and they literally had like a lockbox with like a handcuff come out of the pharmacy with one joint of stale swag from Old Mississippi Pharmacy production, federally funded production, and they like had this. I should have put a slide of that because they had this entire like robot so that no one else in the room was subjected to secondhand smoke. I'm going to actually go to. Let's see if we can. I'm just going to let this scroll for a minute. I will be able to share these slides with y'all, so I don't know if I can even pause this or anything. But yeah, I think it's a little too fast. Sorry. But what we're finding, and here's where the big difference between CBD and THC really comes to play. And specifically, that is right now when we talk about how important it might be to differentiate hemp from marijuana, the law at present is that hemp is legal. And hemp is legal when it has very, very low THC. You can have hemp cereal that you buy at the co-op. You could have hemp cordage on your necklace. You could have hemp shoes. I should have worn my hemp shoes. I didn't. But all these things are, 50 states legal. You can buy them on the internet. Hemp is a totally legal product. The reality of CBD as a product of legal cannabis right now is finding that very interesting gray area, essentially with the family of the branches of the plant that come from medical cannabis, that we're finding this whole other compound, most notably in the mid-1990s, just after legalization of medical cannabis in California. People were finding absolute direct relations to seizure-related ailments, specifically, epilepsy, as well as multiple sclerosis, cerebral palsy, and breeders started making cannabis strains that didn't get people high, that maintained these anti-epileptic properties. And that's Charlotte's Web is one of the varieties that you hear of first, and this is the one that was on like 60 Minutes, CBS, and NBC nightly programs where you see children who, in many cases, are convulsing for over 20 hours a day, their entire lives, and most of their lives have been giving these incredibly potent pharmaceutical cocktails to attempt to address these seizures, and of course, their livers are being destroyed, and all of the other consequences of these pharmaceutical compounds are becoming all too clear when these children are living on these types of medications. And then they give them essentially drops of natural medicine, which, if you've seen the news shows and stuff like that, the seizures calm and stop almost immediately. So that's really where we first started paying attention to CBD as a specific compound. And let's see if I can get back here a little bit. And the CBD is the cannabidinol, which is a very interesting part of these compounds. So I might even be able to zoom in on some of these. Yeah, I can. If you guys want to look at a couple of the things, and I also have some handouts for folks so we can look at what's starting to emerge with, for instance, terpenes, right? So what are terpenes? Terpenes are the odor signatures of these different properties of plants. And so you have the piney terpenes, you have the citrus terpenes, just like we have in the case of mint. Mint is another plant with very potent terpenes, which, given to gardeners who have the ability to choose and select and breed for what they want, you can end up with chocolate mint or lemon mint or these very, very potent odor signatures that are closely related plants but smell so differently. So that's one of our keys to what's going on with different properties. And of course, right now, the art of cannabis medicine is really getting into the nitty-gritty and finding this out. There are still no federal studies, as I mentioned, but increasingly on the state level, state university level, and also simply because finally there's a legal market. We're seeing some really interesting things. So in terms of growing cannabis, one of the things that most people are familiar with, but that is an important point of introduction to folks who are not, is that we typically have these plants expressing as dioecious. So oikos, it's funny, I wanted to see if I could find a Greek house or something, searching images for oikos. It's all yogurt that comes up. But the word oikos is the Greek word for home. It's the root of the word ecology, the study of the home, and it's the root of the word economy, the management of the home. How those two became potentially so at odds is concerning, to say the least. The word dioecious means of two houses. So many of our famous garden plants are dioecious, like the kiwi, for instance. We have males which make pollen and pollen only, and then we have females which are the only ones that make fruit. So in a similar vein, the cannabis plant in most cases is expressed dioeciously, with a male plant having only male flowers and a female plant having only female flowers. Interestingly, cannabis is not always dioecious, and in fiber and seed production, we're actually increasingly selected for monoecious one-house varieties, which means they are making both male and female flowers, which, as you can imagine, if you're trying to grow seed as your crop, you have tremendous advantages in. If you have a monoecious cannabis plant, then all of your plants are making pollen, and all of your plants are able to receive that pollen and will have yield of seed. Now, in the case of your CBD, in the case of your THC, in the case of your buds, so to speak, you are typically growing females and females only. And females, in the absence of males and pollen, continue to develop their calyx indefinitely. And really what you're looking at when you're looking at cannabis buds are unpollinated female flowers. And a lot of that sticky resin that has these concentrated properties that we're looking to for medicinal and recreational purposes are actually intended to catch pollen and wind-drifted pollen. So this is something that's going to be a very important part of our conversation as we move forward into legal industries, because there will be people looking to grow isolated females for purposes of CBD, which is also expressed best in the female flower when unpollinated, and of course your traditional THC-rich varieties, which are also grown without pollen. So you guys have heard the word sinsemilla as one of our many slang terms for marijuana. Does anybody understand how that breaks down? Does any Spanish speakers? Yeah.
Without seed.
Exactly, sinsemilla, without the seed. So sinsemilla is really a word not just for marijuana or the cannabis plant generally, but specifically those female flowers that have never been pollinated, because of course once they're pollinated, seeds will set. What I'm showing you here in this picture are your pre-flower sex indicators. So in very, very young plants, and I guess this is the real unveiling here, right? And actually, I brought like more stuff that I'm going to pull out because I'm in a school and I want to be careful. But if anybody wants to, for instance, see like our CBD buds and what they look like, I'm happy to show those. So they survived the sub-freezing temperatures here, and I am going to just turn on my camera here for a minute. I'm going to take that out and see if this works. Oh yeah, it did. Oh yeah. Okay, sorry, there you go. Hey everybody. But let's go ahead. Is that coming in at all for y'all?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so I'm gonna play with focus and stuff, and you can see these tiny, you can see these tiny little hairs, which are calyx and pistils, and the indications of a female flower. If you have a male, slang is testes, right? They're not testes at all. But they are the male flowers. So you have, these are your females, these are your males. And now you might wonder, how do you make more plants if you're growing only female plants? And how do I start plants to have female plants? When you're sow seed, you don't know whether you'll have male or female, and that's why we can show things like this. But it takes, several weeks of growth before your plants get mature enough to be able to sex them. At which point, most people will simply compost all the males, and it's a loss. All the seeds that you bought and germinated and watered for weeks are gone. So I don't want to discourage anyone from growing from seed, because every seed is a genetically unique individual, and that's how we continue to discover new varieties. But most plants are propagated via cuttings. And when you have a known female of known genetic character, especially when you're looking for concentrations of certain compounds like high in CBD, low in THC. So just to further clarify, this is a Vermont legal CBD plant. This particular strain is cherry wine. It's a very high CBD. Our crop tested out at 18.5% CBD, which is pretty high, and very, very low THC, hopefully lower than 0.3, which is the legal threshold for hemp as distinct from marijuana. So really the CBD market is twofold. One is, yes, the potent medicinal properties of CBD are very valuable, and they are the pieces that you might associate more with like body high, and this is why people are using them for a variety of like neurodegenerative ailments, as well as things like arthritis and joint pain, and like you can buy CBD isolates in dog treats now to give to your dog for its joints. So this is cherry wine, and this is a known female, and I have very high confidence of exactly what proportions of THC and CBD, etc., will result in the end crop, because it's a clone. Because I literally took one piece, cut it, dipped it in, we'll talk, I guess, a little bit about rooting for cutting. Now, the most conventional means are various root hormones, and you can go to any grow shop, gardener supply store, or even Home Depot, and buy various root powders or gels, which work once you put your stem of a cut piece into a root gel and then into a rock wool medium. Let's actually, we'll go back to that. That's what it would look like once successfully rooted. And that way it's entirely genetically identical to its parent. So you know it's going to be female, you know what concentrations of different compounds it's going to have. That said, if your mother plant has any viral disease or disease like powdery mildew or things like that, you're going to carry them from plant to plant as you continue to propagate, which is another reason why I encourage people to start from seed. But if you want to know that you're going to have Black Gorilla or Girl Scout cookies, which are names of strains, then you will need to get it cutting. Now, that's one way to continue to grow plants of known genetics and to know females. Another is what's called feminized seed. And feminized seed is a kind of advanced technique, but worth knowing about, especially if you're shopping for seeds. You'll find seeds at one price and feminized seed at an exponentially higher price. Because here are seeds, and as I said, every seed is a genetically unique individual. So you don't entirely know what you're going to get, but you could also have known parentage. So you would know this seed is the exact offspring of these two parents. So just like children, you never know exactly what the child's going to look like, but you do know that the child will have properties of both of its parents combined, right? So feminized seed is a really fascinating thing. When you have two female marijuana plants, two female cannabis plants, you can force them to make pollen and not only cannabis, but many of our dioecious plants are not as truly dioecious, as perfectly dioecious as we'd like to think them to be. Just like humanity, gender is frankly more of a spectrum than a one or the other, right? And when subjected to various stressors, a female plant will start making pollen. And that said, those are not the ones that you want to make feminized seed from, because then the characteristics of its going hermy, as it's called, turning to a hermaphrodite plant, is likely to be passed on in future generations. And that's something that ideally we're selecting against. Then, when you have a known female that's gone by control hermaphrodite, and you cross it with a known female, you not only have seeds from the parents of two really good varieties, but all of those seeds will then be female. And so that is what a feminized seed is, and that is why feminized seed costs so much more than regular seed, because they're coming from both parents being females.
Are there strains now where there's no males?
So so every strain technically is one genetically unique individual, and they are propagated from females. So essentially, most of our strains are only females, and some of them are more prone to go hermaphroditic naturally, which is generally something breeders try to avoid. And that's one of the reasons why they force hermaphrodite, is so that they can have, that they can avoid that property. But again, like anything in this incredible world of diversity of plants, who knows what really shakes out in the end, right? Some of the best varieties of any of our plants, are maybe not the ones best able to be cut and rooted. And the ones that are both excellent and easily cut and rooted, just like, for instance, apples, you can mail them around the country in boxes and keep them dormant in root cellars, like hanging out naked. Like, that's one of the reasons why apples have had so much success in getting all around the world. Whereas you take the pawpaw, which is no less promising as a food plant, but doesn't like to be moved around the country in boxes, doesn't like to be hanging out naked, bare root and dormant, and is just that much less naturally adaptable to being moved around. So some varieties are, how they respond to these stressors like forced hermaphroditism, how well they root when cuttings are taken, and how well they behave, especially of late indoors. And that's the thing that's really interesting, again, as we kind of come, quote unquote, out of the closet, is we'll have all of these other landrace strains and more, heirloom genetics from these traditional strains of cannabis that don't fit in closets and basements and warehouses where almost all the cannabis in the world at present is grown. The last one that I'll share with you is another one that's maybe more valuable in that I will create a link that y'all can, but it's a nice little chart that gives you both deficiency and excess properties to look for, starting with your NPK, your main macronutrients, and looking at like calcium, magnesium, sulfur, zinc, manganese, boron, and what properties you might find in your plants. So personally, I do think that there's a lot of promise to bringing cannabis outdoors. I think there's a lot to be said about the sun and the rain and the soil especially. I see some of the advantages of hydroponics, and certainly when it comes to those aspects of control, hydroponics are the ultimate in that you control the timing of the light, you control the temperature, you control the temperature of the water, you control to the milligram the nutrients in those water. But I'm personally not a big fan of hydroponics. Hydroponics, even when it comes to hydroponic food, I just have to say, I'm one of those people that's, keep the soil inorganic. I think that the complexities of soil microbiology are, far from fully understood. And to imagine that we can reduce it, yes, you can reduce it and get like good yields. But personally, I think there's a lot to be said about soil, even if you are growing indoors. And certainly when we can move outdoors, we're going to see a whole other wave of selection criteria. For instance, we just now have, what are they calling it? Somebody might know. It's called lobsters and blueberries or something so classically Maine. And it's a variety of cannabis specifically bred for our very short season. And that's another factor in terms of going outdoors, is many of these are long season. Accepting autoflower, so here's a whole other kind of little piece that we can go into a little bit. In terms of light timing, depends on whether these plants are focusing predominantly on vegetative growth, growing their physical structure, growing their plants and leaves and stems and roots. This is a plant that I just pulled from a veg cycle. So this plant is on 16 hours of light right now, 8 hours of darkness. It doesn't need any darkness, frankly, but it just gives you a little bit of a break in the electric bill. And personally, I think there is something to be said about letting the plant have some dark and whatever other organisms might be in the soil having some dark. Once you go to a 12-12, that equatorial zone day length and night length, these plants start producing their flowers. So essentially, even with this tiny little plant, if I put it onto a 12-12 cycle, it would stop putting its energy into growing more stems and leaves and branches and start putting all of its energy into its reproductive structures. So that said, what we're primarily doing here is growing out our starts for both cuttings so we can make more to plant out our fields. And because we have these plants that don't necessarily finish in a 100-day or 90-day season, which we might have in northern Vermont, like tomatoes, for instance, we're putting out as mature of plants as we possibly can with the last frost. Yes?
If you're making cannabis, cannabidiol, I think it's called, is it better to use the buds and the leaves together, or is it only the buds that have
That's a great question. So I will be completely honest and say that, I mentioned how the CBD plants are coming really from the strain of recreational marijuana bred to be legal under hemp rule by not having THC. And because there are people who want to use cannabis, but they are CDL or law enforcement or drug tested, and they don't want any THC, or they simply don't want any debilitating or disorienting impacts from these plants. So yes, they usually are produced by way of female flowers, and that's to maximize the concentration of CBDs. That said, and I think it's important to note that cannabis is not the only plant that has cannabinoids. When you have just the flowers, you tend to possibly test over the limit for THC. So by including leaves is how you blend to make sure any product that you would create is legal on the marketplace.
So you would use both?
I would use both, yeah. Yeah, and absolutely, I mean, the leaves are less, so where these compounds are concentrated are our trichomes, and I would need more than to show you through my phone. They are visible to the naked eye, but better seen with like a 20x hand lens, and this is how you know when your crop is ripe. So when I was a kid, we'd look at all the orange hairs and all the crystals, and they were like, wow, we could tell by looking like what would be a more potentially potent pop, right? Turns out the hairs, can tell us a lot about the plant and its genetics, but aren't where THC or CBD are concentrated. It's really the trichomes, and the trichomes are these little glands. You know what else is a trichome? The stinging part of a stinging nettle is also a trichome. So if you can think of what a stinging nettle, those little white hairs look like, on the cannabis plant, those trichomes grow little balls on the tops of them like a lollipop, but it's way smaller. It looks like a lollipop when you're looking through like a 50x lens, right? And those will be very clear when they start out, and they will get, as the plant matures, increasingly cloudy or amber in color. Traditionally, it's just as they start to turn amber is when it's time, you have your maximum potential to cut down your plant. That said, honestly, for a home grower, I think your preferred technique might be to harvest that top bud that's ripe right away and leave the rest of the plant to then get all this more light and air around it, and you can have a sustained harvest. It's something like when we have our just like in food crops, right? We have a lot of our selection criteria geared towards migrant labor. So in the case of strawberries, for instance, we're breeding most of the commercially available strawberries are bred to all fruit at once, so that a team of folks coming through for 3 or 5 days can get almost all of that harvested and then move on. Whereas if you're a home gardener, do you want to have to deal with all of your strawberries in 3 to 5 days for the entire season? Or would you rather, like every morning, just pick a little bowl of strawberries and have it to continue to produce? So just like in strawberries, cannabis is one where the home grower and home user has an incredible potential to enter the realm of breeding with much different selection criteria than commercial growers who are looking to have crews and minimize labor hours as some of their breeding criteria, right? So when we're looking at our trichomes, the Rastafarian tradition is the clear trichomes. So they go a little bit early. If you're going for making hash, you go for those really dark, really mature trichomes. So what time does this end? Sorry.
11:15.
It ends at 11:15. So I have a few other things, but let's take a moment if there are questions, comments. I'm happy to respond to some. Yeah, the way back, and then Doug.
Do feminized seeds perform less well outdoors than just seeds that?
That's a great question. Genetics would be a more important factor than whether they were produced by way of feminized seed or not. And absolutely, we are learning, especially in the Northeast, how we grow for a shorter season, what does well with our weather. And, so if anyone's been following what's happened in Vermont, 2 years ago we had, I think, 12 licenses for our legal CBD state license thing. In 2017, we had 89 licenses. So it was a factor of growth of more than 4. And every single person who grew CBD in Vermont this past year had the most excellent fall for ripening flowers and maturing buds, like on record, right? And all these folks with all this enthusiasm, and I don't want to dampen anyone's enthusiasm, but it's just as likely to have freezing rain all October instead of like weeks of 80 with no rain for like 3 weeks, where everybody's plants went boom and just like really, really fleshed out. So that's of course our risk with outdoor, is when do we cut down? Surprisingly frost hardy, the cannabis plant, we tend to think of it as a tropical plant, it obviously is, but they can definitely take 30 degrees, 29 degrees, and when they're mature and in flower, just sort of shake it off in the morning when the sun comes up again. But the trick is how we deal with moisture during harvest, and that's really the biggest criteria of like an outdoor factor, is which ones, which ones are prone to things like powdery mildew, which ones not only finish in a short season, but can like deal with the stressors of unpredictable weather, which isn't to say we wouldn't water when it's dry, but so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, feminized seed would be more about the parental genetics than whether they were produced by feminized or not. So we have Doug and then the woman right in front of Doug.
Organic production.
Yes, thank you. So thank you very much.
That's the title of your talk.
Yes, that gets us back into the soil, right? And that's again where we're looking at with this. A really good compost is the basis of everything, right, that we're growing. Worm castings are one of my favorite amendments. And worm castings, more so than any kind of NPK type fertilizer, are much more of a microbial inoculant. And I started going here when I was talking about cuttings, because I mentioned how there's all these off-the-shelf root hormones and things like that. So thanks for bringing me back to that. Because what we've been experimenting with are totally organic, site-produced rooting hormones and rooting compounds. And to be honest, you could totally take cuttings and stick them in rock wool, and with the right humidity, temperature, moisture, and air, most of them will root. This is a plant very prone to root itself by way of cuttings. But typically we are dipping the cutting into a root hormone, which encases that new wound with those hormones and triggers the roots, the roots producing almost immediately. Let's look at that for a second. So what are we working with for site-produced root hormones? Well, aspirin is one of the ones that's really interesting. I'm not working with aspirin, but aspirin, of course, is related to the salicylic acid, which gets its name from the salix, willow. Willow water, willow tea, as it's often called, is potent in root hormones. And in fact, I make willow tea simply for watering all of my starts, vegetable and otherwise, during their first establishment. As I transplant, I water everything with willow water. Willow is incredibly high in auxin. That's of course why you can take a branch of willow, stick it in the mud, and it starts sprouting new leaves and growing new roots out of the bottom. Or you can take your pussy willow cuttings right now, bring them into a vase in your home, and get these beautiful pussy willow flowers on your kitchen table weeks before they'll be outdoors, and at the same time observe the phenomenon of the entire vase being colonized by willow's roots. And so those exudates that happens in that water when your willow's rooting in that water make an incredibly potent root hormone. The other one, which I'm just beginning to play with now, is aloe. Aloe is one of my absolute favorite plants anyway, that it's also very high in salicylic acid. So what's recommended, and I can't say there's a lot of controlled study of what's working best, and by all means when it comes to like cloning and propagation there is a lot of options out there, but dipping your cuttings right in the aloe leaf that you just cut off the plant is going to encase it in root hormones, and then maybe mist it with the willow tea, and you'll have a tremendous degree of success. The other thing, of course, if you're doing something a little bit more large scale, is making aloe smoothie, like filling an entire blender with aloe leaves, and then you have it, and it can keep for up to 2 months, they say, as far as its root hormone properties. Any other specific questions in terms of organic? Because the other thing I'd just like to say is, the frontiers of this, especially outdoor, are in cannabis polycultures. I think, the time has passed of seeing, monocultures of anything, and it's really exciting to look at what's doing well in the understory of cannabis, what's doing well in the overstory of cannabis. Cannabis, as we looked at where it's native to in Eurasia, and what are these forests that were so critical to early humanity? Well, it's the home of the walnut, it's the home of hops, it's the home of apples, and it's the home of cannabis. This is a natural ecosystem with an overstory of walnuts, an understory of apples, an herbaceous layer of wild cannabis and hops, and varied mushrooms, pot herbs, and greens on the ground. I think these, Kazakhstani type forests are definitely models to replicate. So, ma'am, you had a question?
Yeah, going back to the other end of the season, how early do you need to start those to get a good-sized transplant out in the field when the weather's right?
Great question, yeah. So it depends on what you're trying to grow, whether that's fiber, seed, CBD, or THC. But again, the flowering is determined by day length. And it's, again, that 12-12. So if you're indoor, it's 12-12 is your flower cycle. What time of the year is 12-12?
June?
Yeah. So it's the equinox. The only day of the year, the only 2 days of the year when night and day are equal at 12 and 12. So regardless of what size your plant is, as we approach the equinox, they're going to start flowering. So essentially, the bigger you can put your transplants out, the higher your yields will be. But even an immature plant will begin to flower as it approaches the equinox time of year.
So you're putting them out when you would put out whatever, tomatoes?
Yeah, maybe even a little earlier. They're nowhere near as tender as a tomato. So it depends on whether your system has opportunity for row cover or whatever. As of now, most folks, even outdoor, are often in greenhouses simply because of cover and the need for discretion with these plants. The other thing, and this is a whole other topic in itself, but it's worth mentioning, light deck. And that's one of the things, especially in warmer climates, but I do think there is some potential to explore it in places like Vermont and New Hampshire. So light deprivation is, so in June, our ratio is, something closer to like 18 hours of sunlight and 6 hours of darkness. And what growers are doing is they're building essentially high tunnels or hoop houses which cover not only for frost protection or whatever, but cover for total darkness and light elimination. So you can have during the peak of summer a 12-12 cycle outdoors. And the other thing that's really nice about those systems, if you were to invest in it, they can be very, very simple if you have just a few plants, with just a heavy tarp. Or, you can have, like in California, where we have some really interesting things happening in the cannabis industry world. We have giant high tunnels with automated, light depth hoops that just on a timer go every single day. Because that is a very significant chore. It's just like becoming a dairy farmer if you're setting up some type of manual light depth, because you cannot miss a day or you lose your you'll lose that plant's response.
Can I follow up on that just a tiny bit?
Yeah.
So from the point where you have 12-12 and flower production starts,
Yes.
how long a period, granted, if you start that in September, when it happens naturally, you may not have long enough to get a harvest. How long do you need, in just ballpark?
Yeah,
How long a period do you want to see when you can expect maturity?
What happens from that point, once you start making flowers, then the flowers just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why pollen is kept out of the system, is because the nature of this plant is, when starved of pollen, to indefinitely produce its female flowers in hopes that there'll be some pollen drifting on the wind. And so just the short answer is maybe 3 to 4 weeks if you can, right? I mean, we cut down a lot of our crop October 13th this year, but saved some because the forecast didn't look like it was going to be that hard. It was more like October 20th before we had everything out of the ground. That said, I will go back to what I was saying about the hand lens and the trichomes, because while they'll continue to get bigger, they might not continue to get better. And you really want to keep a careful eye on those trichomes as the primary indicator of like optimal ripeness. And the whole plant or the whole field won't necessarily come ripe all at once. And so if you have just 2 or 3 plants in a place that's very well cared for, you by all means can cut off that bud that's the ripe one already going maybe overripe, and then not only will the other ones continue to mature, they will get much larger than they were when that plant was supporting its cola, its central bud. And I won't have time to get into it today, but I think it's worth talking about briefly, just introducing the incredible variety of pruning techniques, which, you know, essentially by pinching the top, like you can see, you know, all these little buds where all the next leaves are already coming out. If I pinch the top, this plant is going to get a lot more branches than if it's putting its energy into growing straight up. And that's where we see things like sea of green, which is what your search term would be if you wanted to explore some of these pruning techniques, which, you know, so an operation that I consult with in California is a very small operation by California standards, but this guy has, you know, 100-foot high tunnels, just like we see our vegetables here in Vermont, with raised beds about, you know, I don't know, 30 inches high, all very carefully crafted compost filled, and it's just a box hedge. I mean, the plants, so like the tops of the raised beds are maybe here, and then the tops of the plants are only maybe 2 feet above that. And the entire thing is held in a plastic mesh, like a fencing type product, so that, you know, they move around in the wind a little bit, but everything is supported and nothing breaks and falls down. And there's, like, you can't differentiate one plant from the other when you go, until you go into the soil and you see where they're planted, but it's literally a box hedge. And if you imagine like your pruned cedar hedge that's like square on the top, 3 feet wide, running 100 feet long, all colas, all cannabis flower. So, yeah.
What are the major pests or diseases that you would?
Yeah, so depends on whether you're talking about indoor or outdoor. Powdery mildew is one of the most problematic. Like, it's one of the things, again, like, if, you know, that's one reason to start from seed, because if you're not very careful of who you're getting cuttings from, you can inherit someone else's problem. Mites are obviously another big problem, especially indoors. Honestly, outdoors, in my opinion, is way easier than indoors, because while you don't have as much control over the variables that you do indoors, you're also not responsible for all those variables like you are in indoors. And an indoor environment is generally, in the case of things like mites and things like that, you know, they can become exponentially problematic, whereas in the ecosystem, there's way more checks and balances. The fact of the matter is, I have, you know, so we've only been growing legal CBD for 2 years in Vermont. In terms of my like 1 or 2 other plants that I would hide around wherever, whenever, I've never had any insect problems outdoors ever.
So there's no specific to the plant type diseases or?
No, it's the same powdery mildew that you're going to get from your pumpkins or whatever, which is again why, you know, if you are growing cannabis next to, especially cucurbits, which tend, you know, they get the powdery mildew and it's the end of their year and they're done and it dies. But if you have, you know, that surviving in your soil, if you have that in nearby adjacent plots, you want to be extra preemptive in culling those plants and eliminating those plants as soon as possible.
If you had a strain of cannabis that you knew cured epilepsy or helped with epilepsy for particular people, could you grow that in Vermont if the legal requirements are that you have this particular strain, or are you restricted by the types of strains you can grow
Yeah,
Anyone
so
know there's-
right now in Vermont, you would either have to have a strain that was expected to be below 0.3% THC, 0.03%.
Even though a 40% THC and CBD, 60% CBD could cure a particular disease, you couldn't do that.
If it was over the 0.3%, you would need to be licensed through the medical program, which right now, and this is one of the frontiers that we're hoping for, is because there is a legal medical market, is to have growers like myself be able to produce for that market. But right now, no. Right now, there's...
Didn't Vermont just legalize personal cultivation for like 3 plants?
Yes. So, yeah. So let me... Yes, thank you.
Sorry.
So, yeah, but that's important. Yeah. So, that said, yeah. One is you could have a license, and if you have a specific ailment that a doctor approves, and right now that's expanding. What they it used to be when Vermont debuted its medical program, it was very, very conservative. Whereas in 1996, when California pioneered a medical marijuana licensure program, it frankly was a loophole intended to decriminalize marijuana. I mean, you could go literally on the internet, and if you had to actually sit with a real doctor, but they had doctors on websites who would just sit there and like, yeah, oh, you have stubbed your toe, here's your script. And, it costs $40. And it's interesting because, of course, when we look to the history of Prohibition, the same thing is true of alcohol, right? Even during the extremes of alcohol prohibition, prescriptions for alcohol were legal and was the way that most folks kept their weekly bottle of whiskey or whatever they had, which in fact was the birth of Walgreens Pharmacy as a national chain, was fulfilling people's alcohol prescriptions during Prohibition. So you could get a license, and or you could be a caregiver. Both of those, however, if you have any history with a drug offense or cannabis illegal behavior, you're not only you're not allowed, or it's very cumbersome. Now, just as of this past legislative session, as of July 1st, you are allowed 2 mature plants and 4 immature plants with unlimited storage of the harvest of those plants, but no more than an ounce on your person out in public. So the answer is now, yes.
Vermont.
In Vermont. But New Hampshire has just passed 3/4 of an ounce decriminalized. I actually have all the notes because I was trying to be up on it, but and 2, you can grow 2 plants, and I'm not sure, that just passed February 2018. I don't know when it goes into effect, but February 2018 the bill was passed.
How many plants did you say?
2 mature plants. Yeah, I'll look that up though before you go. Per person, so maybe per household. Vermont is per household, not per person.
I think it was 6. I thought it was 6, but 2 of them would be insured.
In New Hampshire?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll look it up so that I don't misquote.
You mentioned a potential role for regenerative farms.
Yeah, thanks. So, perhaps most significantly is recognizing, A, this is an annual crop. It's a relatively heavy feeder. So I think it's important to note, like, I don't, and I've seen these operations where people are like, oh, we're putting 500 acres in cannabis. And that's, the other thing that I as a grower, I think there's a couple things happening. One is, as we're seeing this legalized, we're seeing major money players step in. And for instance, what's happened in California is they had this kind of gray market. Everybody grew for these medical, legal outlets. And now they've gone fully recreational. And companies, big businesses have set up and really pushed a lot of the small folks out just by way of the workers' compensation and licensure expenses and things like that. So perhaps most importantly is its economic potential, in my opinion, conserving farmland and using it right. It definitely has the potential to be a carbon sequestration, a carbon sponge in our landscape, especially when we look at the biomass, the amount of biomass produced, and that's again why it's so promising for fiber and fabric for textiles. When that biomass is properly incorporated back into soil systems and or compost piles, I see this as absolutely a major carbon sponge. As a heavy feeder, it's a major nutrient uptake. So in my opinion, if we have, for instance, dairy effluent, if we have like any kind of like high nutrient loss situations, cannabis buffers are going to be awesome in protecting our waterways. It's an excellent windbreak while it's mature, but that's a small window. So if you're protecting other parts of your garden, for instance. I think the future lies really in figuring out these careful polycultures where it's one part of a complex system that includes other aspects of carbon farming. So that's a really great question. In fact, I'd love to have expanded on that a little bit more.
So I think this is a really important issue to myself and people who are just getting into cannabis. Do you have any tips or tricks for identifying cannabis that's been produced with toxic substances like Avid, Eagle 20, any fungicides, herbicides that somebody claims?
Yeah, know your source, right? It's the same as the question about the solvents, right?
Yeah.
Like know your source or produce your own.
I asked specifically because some of the medical dispensaries that I've had personal experience with in these operations, I won't say where I'm from, we're on video, throw black trash bags over the cameras, douse their stuff in fungicides, and then take the trash bags off.
Yeah.
And then claim
I'm glad you mentioned that because, and Doug's question too, I mean, the reality is having been a black market / gray market crop for the majority of its recent history, there's very, very little regulation. Right now, the NOP, the National Organic Program, will not weigh in on cannabis at all because they're federal. And it's really interesting, Maine is having a very interesting break with the NOP because they want to certify cannabis. Vermont is certifying hemp, and there's some issues to be worked out about the CBD and what's going to happen with that. CBD is, while I mentioned this kind of loophole for the hemp consideration, right now we have the federal government saying, actually, even though it's low in THC, we're going to consider CBD a drug, Schedule I drug, and it's subject federally, this would get me in as much, this is a hemp plant, not a marijuana plant, and this would federally, it's no different. I'm facing the same charges. That said, so January 1st, 2018, we had for the first time ever a recreationally legal market in California, one of the biggest cannabis markets in the world in itself. The California economy is one of the biggest economies in the world, larger than many other countries. And they tested things that came out in these dispensaries January 1st, and over 80% tested positive for pesticides or fungicides. Yeah. Most growers who don't care, even if they're producing organically, will then use anti-mold compounds during the curing and drying process. So it's frankly, I don't want to scare folks by saying how dangerous it is. You don't know what's out there, but absolutely, I think our best bet is to have greater transparency, and it's on every front. I mean, just recently I was on a panel with a sheriff, and he was counterpoint, like for and against illegal cannabis industry, and I sat down and I made notes, and every single thing that the sheriff said as to why he doesn't want to see cannabis I was in entire agreement with and see solved by a transparent legal industry, right? So, in other words, having some certification programs, having some folks do it. As far as basic tests, there's nothing I can say. Like, I mean, obviously there's certain odor signatures, especially the anti-fungi, like anti-mildew things that you might be able to detect. I mentioned I have some terpene chart cards for everybody who wants one. I also have another one that's like a little primer of like how to inspect your cannabis products, and it's for quality and like what you might look for. But besides testing, there's no way to know for sure. Besides testing and or knowing the grower, there's no way to know for sure. Last questions from anyone?
I have one.
Okay.
I had a friend who had a tomato plant in like a huge, 20-gallon bucket, whatever, and he brought it inside a couple of winters ago, and it just kept producing tomatoes all winter. Like he had fresh tomatoes in his house.
Yeah.
Could you do something like that with the cannabis plant, or is it just eventually going to die off, or would just keep producing?
That's a great question. I mean, it's certainly possible. So what will happen eventually as an annual, after flowering, it will kind of get senescent, tired, old, and then can re-veg. So it's certainly possible. Whether it's possible to have like a cut and come again on a 12-12, I haven't tried it, and I have a feeling that if it were, we'd be hearing more about it. But by all means, there's more to discover for sure. So I think if you had like a very interesting cut and come again where you kept, the problem is, like I said, the plant does its vegetative growth during longer days, shorter nights, and then once it's 12-12, it really stops investing, and so it wouldn't continue to produce the vegetative architecture to continue to support the flowers that you're cutting off. Is probably the reason why not. Yeah.
Just going to ask, how is it with pollinators as a farmer that owns a farm?
Yeah, right. So you will see bees working cannabis. There are beekeepers who have trained bees to produce cannabis-infused honey. And of course, not only cannabis, but variety of honeys made from psychotropic plants can maintain those psychotropic properties. So that's something, to be wary of. Like, in other words, you could potentially have honey that would, if it was accessed in concentration on cannabis, you could have intoxicating effects resulting from that honey. It is a wind pollinated plant, however, so it's not specifically adapted to attract insects. It's pretty interesting, the cast of characters that you see by way of bugs. There's a few, like, I don't know what their real name is, I call them cannabis spiders, because there's these spiders that, like Michael Phillips was showing us before, the spiders that kind of mesh with the pear flowers perfectly. I don't know the real name of the cannabis spider, but it lives on the cannabis plant and is camouflaged with the cannabis plant. We obviously didn't introduce it; it showed up, from the wild in Vermont. But it's a very interesting insect ecology, which so far, again, we haven't had much. It seems to have maintained balance outdoors, and indoors the mites are really where the big problem is. It's not much of a pollinator supporter. I would look to other plants to support that ecosystem in addition to cannabis. Okay, great. So my website's prospectrock.org. I'll invite you to visit us at the farm anytime that you'd like. Whether it's by a tour or for an event, we invite you to join us for that. So stay in touch, and thanks for coming out, and thanks for supporting us.